Hello, everyone. I am Mr. E,
And I am Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator.
and we are the Duality of Man. And today we are here to talk to you about homelessness, specifically homelessness in regards to men, because I feel this is an issue that really not enough people talk about it. And I thank Dalton for suggesting this topic for today's discussion.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to bring this up within the context of men's issues because the last time I looked at the data, and we might have some new data to look at today, but the last time I looked at the data, it was something like 94% of the unsheltered homeless, meaning the homeless without access to things like homeless shelters or government safety nets and so on, are male. And yet somehow this is not regarded largely as a men's issue by anyone, and that boggles my mind. Given that if 94% of women were, or 95% of the homeless were women, there would be freaking martial law. Let's not beat around the bush about it.
Okay, so let's start off. Obviously, homelessness, a terrible problem. What do you think are some of the causes that get people into this situation to begin with?
Um, I think a large part of it is not being able to find a place in society at large, and or not being able to cut it at whatever standard society at large might enforce upon you. And of course, there's also the mental illness or untreated mental disorder aspect of it that um, both can be exasperated by homelessness, but also can in some ways be caused by homelessness.
I think it also could be economic, just for whatever reason um, you're having trouble finding work, or you have work but you're not earning enough to sustain yourself.
Mhm.
And I think last episode, one interesting thing that was brought up because we talked about marriage was a high percentage of people who become impoverished after divorce are men.
Yep, because alimony, child support payments, arrears, and often even um, legal wage garnishment. If you're behind in your child support payment, one of the first thing they'll do is garnish your wages, which kind of makes being able to catch up on said child support payment a little bit counterintuitive. Like, you're not paying us enough money, so we're gonna take more money from you. Okay, but doesn't that kind of make it? And then the other thing of, after that comes the taking away of your driver's license. Well, if you can't get to the job at which you make money, how are you supposed to get to your job and make money in that case? I guess it's a little bit easier in big cities that have a lot of public transportation, but still, in principle, it's ridiculously counterintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, you're struggling to make these payments, some of which can be ludicrous, and they're only making it harder for you um, to
To
make
accomplish the
payments.
payments at
Yeah,
some point, yeah.
and you talk about the welfare of the child in the case of child support payments. Don't you think that the child would be better served if their father wasn't living out of their car, if they even have one?
One would assume, but the assumption in most cases when men fail to pay things like child support is that they are being malicious or negligent in some regard to it. There is very little, if any, um, allowance for external circumstances or falling on hard times or any such thing. The average intellectual or charity threshold in these circumstances is very, very low, because we all have this image in our heads of the um mustache twirling deadbeat dad who just doesn't like his kids and doesn't like dealing with his ex-wife or whatever. When in actuality, the world, whether we want to believe it or not, humans can't control everything in the world, unfortunately. And especially with the legal and social biases against men in this regard, um, it's often very hard for um, people in these circumstances to get jobs and keep them. And if they can't get jobs and keep them, well, they can't pay the child support. And oftentimes, the rate of child support is fixed at whatever it was when they broke the couple broke it off. So if you are in a very high paying job and you then lose that job and end up with a slightly less well paying job, then you are obliged to keep the ex and the child in the standard to which they have become accustomed, even if on a practical level you are unable to do so. And it
I
becomes a
mean,
downward spiral of doom.
that's one of the things that gets me. I mean, obviously, if you have a child, you have a responsibility to it, and you should take care of it. But having to pay for your ex, somebody who in all likelihood is choosing not to be married to you anymore, because women initiate more divorces than men. But
Yes.
the fact that you have to continue to pay for that individual's lifestyle is ridiculous because that person is an adult. I mean, do they not have any sense of personal responsibility as far as their own lives?
But gynocentrism, instinctively and evolutionarily, we are determined protect and provide for the women at all costs, even if the government has to do it for them. Therefore, the saintly woman can't possibly intuitively ever do anything wrong, and therefore project all sorts of negligence and malice onto the man in the situation.
Let me bring up something else. Abusive relationships. Obviously, oftentimes you'll hear about women who are attempting to escape abusive relationships and they'll go to a shelter for women. But, you know, men can also have abusive relationships, and oftentimes it's more difficult for them to talk about. And also, there's really no place for them to go. All the shelters that I know of are for women. And if a guy tries to go to one of them, they won't let them in, obviously, because it's
Yeah,
women
there
only.
there are there are women's shelters, women's domestic violence shelters, and there are homeless shelters, but there are no or vanishingly few comparatively men's domestic violence shelters because again the assumption is either that the woman just full stop is not abusive or cannot be the main instigator of abuse in the situation, or that the abuse done by women is um, less severe because women are physically weaker on average, and therefore there is no reason why a man would have a mental breakdown from that domestic violence in the same way that a woman is often expected to in those situations. So
And
if you are a man and she comes at you with a knife, it doesn't matter that she's holding a knife apparently, um, because she is so much physically weaker than you. Um, you're just supposed to take it and never mind psychological and verbal abuse, um, and also never mind the fact that the biases within the police are in and of themselves kind of abusive. There have been many cases reported where a man is being abused by his wife, and he calls the police on her, and he is the one they jump on, beat up, and or arrest because the default assumption is in a situation where domestic violence occurs between a man and a woman, it is the man doing the abusing and the woman who is the victimized party.
yeah, and that stuff just really gets to me. And if anybody doesn't believe that this actually happens, look into the Johnny Depp case and then let us know what you find.
Oh my god. That almost needs to be like an entire episode unto itself one of these days.
It should, it definitely should.
That Amber Heard is a crazy bitch. And Johnny Depp, from all of the available evidence that we have, has the patience of a saint.
I mean, really. I mean, I was really shocked when that audio recording came out. You remember that?
Yeah, I was, and the hilarious thing was, like, he took the time to remind her that the audio recording was on, and yet her behavior didn't change. So even if giving the opposition a great degree of benefit of the doubt here, even if he is abusive when the audio is off to her, which we have seen no evidence of, nor any particular substantive allegations of, even if that is the case, he was smart enough to stop that behavior and to act nonchalant and neutral and patient when the audio was on, which they both knew about, and he reminded her of. And yet she did not change her behavior in the slightest, and or the stuff that she does off camera is even worse.
And just the utter ridiculousness of her argument on that audio. She basically said that he was a loser for getting upset that his wife kept hitting him.
Yeah, and please note that at no point on that recording did she say anything about him being aggressive and hitting her. Much to the contrary, most of the audio and the evidence indicates that one of the things that pisses her off is that he doesn't play the alpha Chad dick role and get aggressive with her. He most of her insults directed at him were how hippie-ish and peaceful and pacifistic and quote unquote pussy whipped he was. So what does that tell you about the dynamics of their relationship?
And I just hope that guy. I mean, I know they're going through a divorce now. I just hope,
He doesn't get taken for all he's worth while she's at it.
yeah, because you saw people on social media acting like he was the bad guy, even after this audio came out.
Even
So
after the evidence was like, no, she literally abused him several ways from Sunday, at least in the section of data that we actually have. And again, not excluding the possibility that both parties might act a little bit differently off recording, off script. But and they are both professional actors, so there is that. But going based on the evidence that we have and all of the circumstantial evidence surrounding the evidence that we have, it looks very much to me like she wants him to be an aggressor. Johnny Depp being the just generally kind of nonchalant hippie dude that he is, doesn't fit that mold, and it pisses her off that he refuses to be the aggressor in the relationship, therefore causing her to abuse him. That seems to be the size and the shape of the situation there.
like, I don't think most guys could be the type of guy that she is looking for. Even guys who are more aggressive, she seems to want a guy that is a little bit off the rails, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, she seems to want, for lack of a better word, what feminists refer to as toxic masculinity in her man. Like a Bluto or a Gaston level of just over the top, unaccountable male machismo. And then some.
I was just thinking, Amber Heard wants to date Amber Heard, but man,
Well, it I I'll give her this tiniest bit of intellectual charity and say that in Hollywood, 99% of the men she's going to meet are high achieving men, And that sort of alpha posturing is more common and more extreme among high achieving men, especially in the performing arts where everyone has an overblown personality. That being said, given that she lives in Hollywood and therefore has her pickings of basically all the high achieving, overblown men she could ever want, why did she settle for nonchalant, hippie, nerdy guy Johnny Depp when I'm sure um I'm sure if she wound up with I can't even think of a good example for the kind of guy she wants, but somebody more in the like aggressive action hero mold, um, she could find someone like that in Hollywood, especially. So one wonders why in the hell she wound up with the most stereotypical hippie nerd guy that she could find in Hollywood, and then still expected him to behave um like um Biff Tannen from Back to the Future, basically.
Yeah. So you said you wanted to talk about unsheltered men um, who are homeless.
Yeah, the unsheltered homeless. And I wanted to focus on that primarily just because I find the notion of sheltered homeless to be a bit counterintuitive. I mean, if you have a shelter, then are you not by definition not homeless? And if you are homeless, then by definition, doesn't that mean you're not sheltered? Um, Not to mention the fact that most of the negative aspects of homelessness are mitigated when it's the sheltered variety of homeless. Like, for example, if you're technically homeless, but you're couch surfing with your friends, you're going to be psychologically a lot healthier. You might still have problems, but you're going to be psychologically a lot healthier than the guy who um, has nothing but a dog and a bottle of wine to his name and is sleeping under an overpass or something.
Yes. Right now, I'm on the website of the Alliance to End Homelessness,
Mm-hmm.
and it says unsheltered homelessness has been on the rise over the last 2 years. Nationally, men are only slightly more likely than women to be unsheltered. 49% of individual men are unsheltered compared to 45% of women.
I'd really have to look at that statistic because that really clashes with some of these other statistics I've heard on the matter.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, it is possible that homelessness in women has been increasing, though it still affects men most of all. We haven't
right.
quite reached gender parity in homelessness yet.
Now, granted, that's not exactly a thing that I would be shooting for. Um, I'd much prefer if the epidemic of homelessness vanished altogether, quite frankly. Um, because I kind of consider it a human rights violation in most cases.
Yeah.
Um,
I agree that homelessness should be ended, but how do you end a problem that's existed since basically the dawn of civilization?
yeah, it's one of those we're going to have to wait until either there's some sort of AI singleton that can calculate all of humanity's problems away, or um, wait for 3D printers to evolve into Star Trek replicators and end scarcity. Is basically the only two actual permanent solutions to homelessness that I can imagine.
Or, here's an idea: the billionaires are going to space. We wait for them to colonize Mars, and then we just move all the homeless into their empty houses.
I mean, you'll probably end up getting sued by a bunch of billionaires and or threatened with a death ray, depending on how far they go into space. Um, so that probably wouldn't be a good idea. although I do think as humanity spreads out more among the stars and there's more property to be had, and again, assuming that we evolve um, or that technology evolves somehow into something approximating a Star Trek replicator. And I do think the best bet for that is going to be something approximating 3D printers evolving into that. Um, but once that happens, then I foresee homelessness, as we know it at least, um, ceasing to be a problem. I think that assuming civilization doesn't end in the next century or so, which is a fairly large assumption given at this point. But assuming that we manage to make it to 2100 or so, I don't think um, the people of 2100 are going to have homelessness as a problem. And I think they'll probably look at us um, in regards to homelessness in the same way we regard the third world and famines in the modern West.
Now, I have another statistic here. It says that estimated share of homeless individuals in the United States in 2020, 29.4% female, 69.6% male. So even if the percentage of unsheltered homeless is closer, because there are more men who are homeless by a good margin, there's a lot more unsheltered men.
Mm-hmm.
So what what steps would you take to, like, say you meet somebody who is homeless, you want to try and get him back on his feet? What was something that you would suggest doing?
I think it very much depends on the individual circumstance of the person, and that's the problem. There are a lot of different roads that can lead you to the same set of circumstances with homelessness. Um, Generally, I think seeing to mental health care would go a long way for a lot of these cases, because it seems like most often when men have a psychological breakdown, it's either they fuck off and become homeless or they fuck off and commit suicide.
Or
Um,
they could just end up in jail.
yeah. Which the gender sentencing gap um, is probably another topic for a future episode of the duality of men or duality of men. But until then, yeah, it very much seems like a lot of the things that land someone in a state of being homeless could be resolved by better mental health care and actually addressing the problems of these people rather than writing them off. It's a little bit of the Arthur Fleck Joker situation almost. Um, of we prefer to view men's problems as personal failings, personal defects, and we prefer to view women's problems as only ever external victimization they're going through. Not saying we should default to one position or the other, but I think a more even-handed keel with both of those assumptions would go a long way to fix this, because I think as a civilization, we are far more accepting of the idea of women as victimized and men as responsible for their own outcomes than we are ever the other way around, where women are responsible for their outcomes and men are in some way being victimized or um, under the yoke of circumstance.
Now, one thing that I've been thinking about is that you know people can have drug problems, and end up homeless because of that. And there are a lot of states and cities that instead of actually trying to get them off the street and get them off drugs, they actually make it easier for them to be homeless, like say in California, and I saw this in New Orleans as well. New Orleans is a very high homeless population, and I know that in California, they have a lot of homeless people who are addicted to drugs, and they will actually give them needles. The Californian government, from what I heard, will give them needles to do drugs and essentially just allow them to remain drug addled and homeless.
What the, why? And speaking from a left leaning perspective for a second here, it doesn't matter how easy you make for them to obtain the drugs if you're still illegalizing the drugs and not holding them to medical quality and purity standards. I personally am in favor of legalizing, taxing, and regulating to medical quality and purity standards most drugs, because most of the problems with drug addiction, quote unquote, come from the things that the impurities in manufacture of street drugs and the things those things are cut with. So if you held them to something more approximating a pharmaceutical or medical quality and purity standard, you, in a lot of cases, couldn't tell the difference between, for example, heroin and morphine. They're chemically very, very similar. It just so happens that one of them is illegal and therefore needs to be manufactured at home from scratch, and the other one is dealt with in a laboratory setting with medical quality and purity standards. But if you hold both of those to medical quality and purity standards, then a lot of the problems will go away. It's the same. It's the same thing with weed. A lot of the problems with people dying from weed had more to do with the fact that the supply they were getting of weed was tainted, and now that marijuana is legal in many places and easier to get and held to a cleaner, um, almost FDA-like standard, a lot of the problems with weed have vanished into thin air. Not to mention, if you legalize, tax, and regulate all drugs, then drug possession doesn't become the capital offense that will easily get you to be thrown in prison, and that will greatly decrease the prison population and the percentage of those people who were non-violent offenders going in and then became violent offenders afterwards because they had to adapt to the prison population. That's my 2 cents on the whole drug issue. But yeah, California, until you successfully manage to legalize, tax, and regulate all drugs to medical quality and purity standards, facilitating illegal drug use is only going to exacerbate the problem because, again, illegal drugs are manufactured in a substandard way and therefore have substandard quality and very often are also poisonous.
Going back to the politicians, I mean, they have done a very terrible job in handling the homeless situation. They spend ridiculous amounts of money on just absolute nonsense, like planting a pride flag on a crosswalk, or building a giant mural to George Floyd, or a statue, or just whatever. Or I remember the mayor of Chicago said that she wanted to allocate money to fight racism or climate change or whatever it is. Meanwhile, they have people in their cities who are genuinely suffering. And, if they focused those efforts onto, building more shelters, you know, creating more programs to help people get off drugs.
Yeah, mental health care, drug legalization, um, drug monitoring for medical quality and purity reasons,
Yeah,
um,
they would rather
on and
focus
on and
on
on the
their
list goes.
They would rather focus on their pet causes that make them appear to actually care than help genuine human beings.
Yeah, because and this is a problem, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this so much. It seems like we all just, on some level, tacitly condone homelessness, like as though the homeless live in like a parallel dimension to the rest of us. And for as many human rights movements that exist in the world, or alleged human rights movements that exist in the world today, nobody seems to want to play victim over the homelessness crisis, even though, because shelter is at the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, anyone who is homeless, regardless of their gender, race, whatever, um, is by definition one of the most victimized um, people on the planet. Um, not to mention the fact that um, for as much as politicians um, want to virtue signal to the poor, the effectiveness thereof varies. But for as much as they want to do that, I've only ever really heard them mention homelessness as kind of a also ran, unless somebody directly brings it up, and even then they'll try to reframe the question in terms of like income inequality and such.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of homeless people in my life, and it, it always seems to me that it's a problem that everybody acknowledges is bad. Like everybody, of course, knows homelessness is bad, but they don't want to spend the time or energy to actually fix
Yeah,
it because
they,
it's such a complex issue that like it would take too much effort from them to actually try and fix it.
or worse yet, we can't spin it into our ideology, so we have no business fixing it. And that's the other thing. I think a lot of people, like I said, play victim over social issues. Um, you've got the communists who will say this is a problem with capitalism and the bourgeoisie, and then you've got the social justice warriors that will say this is the problem with the patriarchy, and then you've got the traditionalists going this is a sign of the devolution of our civilization and how we need to return to traditional values, and on and on and on it goes. But if you can't fit the solution to a problem within those ideological boxes somewhere, it becomes sort of background noise of existence, and you'll get even a lot of people going, this is just a fact of life, this is just normal, leave it alone, let it continue on. No matter what you do, you're always going to have homelessness, so we don't need to address this. Um, and that's the other half of it is the path of normality, and the path of least resistance is, if you can't find a solution to it, find some way to rationalize it in your head as this is just the way the world works. Now, mind you, every single social problem that we've ever dealt with as a species has at one point been just how the world works. Slavery was at one point just how the world worked. Um, Peasantry was at one point just how the world worked, and on and on and on and on we go. Um, non-universal suffrage was at one point just how the world worked. The caste system was at one point just how the world worked. Um, and only when somebody held up their hand and went, "Hang on, why the fuck are we just nonchalantly accepting this because it's normal?" Just because something is normal doesn't make it right or good or just or even unsolvable. It just makes it um, something we passively accept, and then they go about and try to fix it. Um, and I think the biggest problem with homelessness is that sort of resigned default mode everyone just kind of shovels it off into. Like, this is just a thing that happens, when if you apply that to literally every other system in history that humanity has gotten rid of for the most part, we know that if any modern Western person was to go back 200 years to when slavery was still in full force, they would obviously be the one saying, "Are you insane? Slavery is a human rights violation," and treating it as normal or treating it passively is one of the most grotesque things you can do about it. I think in a century or two, again, assuming our civilization doesn't go bust, we will regard homelessness in the same way. And people in the future probably will regard many of the human rights issues facing people today as um, problems in which the solution was so obvious that they can't believe it wasn't solved sooner. Um, and I think history will probably be right to say that, because when you get right down to the nitty gritty, while there might need to be a lot of effort put into homelessness, I think anyone who sits down and thinks about it for more than about 20 minutes can think of at least 5 things that can be done to solve the homeless crisis.
I actually have an idea about that. Um, in a lot of cities, they have a lot of buildings that are, abandoned or just not in use.
Yeah,
Why doesn't the government just lease those buildings from the people that own them and use them to create homeless shelters? I mean, the buildings already exist. You don't have to actually build things. You just have to renovate it for a shelter.
yeah,
And the
and
government loves spending money. I don't see why they couldn't spend some of that money on this, something that would actually help their
yeah,
citizens, people
and
that
as you were saying earlier with all of the earmarks and the pet projects, I don't actually have a problem with spending in principle. What I have a problem with is inefficiency. I find it a little bit annoying and counterproductive that you've got one side of the political IO going, spend all the things, raise spending to a ludicrous degree, and then you've got the other side going, lower spending to a ludicrous degree, even if necessary things get caught in the crossfire. Um, when in actuality, the conversation shouldn't be about should we spend, should we not spend at all. It should be, if we are going to spend, what should that spending go to? What should the results be, or what should the results we're shooting for be? Um, and I think 90% of the spending versus not spending problem could be resolved if we were just more efficient about the way we spend what we already do spend.
I mean, yeah, I mean, we could do a whole episode on government, but what do you think of the plan to take buildings and convert them into homeless shelters, leasing them from private owners?
I think it makes a lot of sense, and would also be a great time to address a related, not identical but related issue, which is a large part of homelessness comes from the fact that massive swaths of our infrastructure have fallen into disrepair and dilapidation, and nobody seems to want to address that issue either. Like, for example, the example everyone always seems to cite whenever this comes up is Flint, Michigan doesn't have clean water in a first world freaking country that is apparently the world hegemon and has all the resources a country could ever want. We still have areas of our country that just don't have the appropriate infrastructure.
I
Um,
heard that was actually fixed, but still, the amount of time that it went on was absolutely unacceptable.
mhm.
But
And in any case, even if Flint finally got fixed because of all the press it got, there are plenty of areas around the country, especially in areas that once had thriving mining communities or manufacturing communities or factory communities, um, that are just like that or very nearly. Um, and there are large parts of America's infrastructure that shut down decades ago and just sort of go through the motions now. Like, there are plenty of communities that they were once a very thriving um, country or a very thriving center of industry, and the industry dried up. So everyone in that town is now either dirt poor or homeless or teetering on the edge of being homeless. But they just don't have the resources or the manpower or whatever to get out of that area.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a big problem. The lack of industry in desperate areas, because American companies, they could invest in these areas. They could, you know, create factories or whatever in order to give these people jobs.
Would
But
also be a fantastic way of screwing over China, just throwing that out there.
I was
But
just about to mention that. But they'd rather, cozy up with the genocidal regime
mm,
at the other side of the world.
yeah, fuck you, CCP.
Yes, that is our
Or
official
hell,
stance here.
even if you need foreign um foreign manufacturing to some degree, and I think to some degree that's reasonable. Why the fuck didn't you do why the fuck didn't you prop up India instead of China? Because India at the very least has the influence of like Western values in its history. Um and therefore they would at least like share to some extent the same worldview.
Also, no genocides that I'm currently aware of.
Yet, so why don't in the next 10 or 20 years or so take the resources you have invested in China, multinational bullshit companies, and shift at least some of them to India so that you can bleed China dry and we can dance on the ashes of the CCP and also free the actual Chinese people.
But also make sure to bring some of the industry home. Like, I don't see why the government doesn't incentivize companies to, create more jobs in America.
Especially because, like I just got through saying, a lot of the infrastructure is there still. It's just fallen into disrepair because nobody bothered to give a fuck. Um, so a lot of the resources you would need to get this going are already still in the areas you left behind. You just need to go back and put some more effort into them.
And, COVID certainly has not helped the situation. I mean, businesses being shut down, people can't work. And now we have a labor shortage because people are getting money to stay home and not work. I mean, that's fine for some people, but what about the people that own those businesses? I mean,
Well, I mean, the other side of that is they're realizing that they're actually making just as much or more um, from that government stipend than they would at their jobs. And I think a lot of people are doing the simple arithmetic of my job is shitty. I make barely enough money at it to survive, and I can do the same on this government stipend. So unless my job either becomes more satisfying for me or I get paid more, why the fuck would I subject myself to that miserable existence when I can just coast on the stipend? I think yes, there's some argument for like entitlement and laziness and whatever, but there's also the other half of it, which is why were you paying your employees a substandard wage to begin with? Why were you um, allowing the people that work for you to live from paycheck to paycheck just barely enough to scrape by?
well, I think it depends on where you live. I mean, people say that a $15 minimum wage needs to be
The
the
national
bare amount
standard,
for
but it
people to
can't be
survive.
because some areas literally are unable to support that infrastructurally. Yes,
I
I
mean,
know.
I'm currently making $12 an hour, and I'm doing all right. But
And you're in Philly, right?
Pittsburgh.
Ah,
But I think it really just does depend on the area. But I mean, when you have to consider that, okay, you want employers to pay their employees more, okay, but they need the money to do that. It may not necessarily be that they're unwilling to do that, but
they might be unable,
yes,
which is fair. But if COVID ended up revealing a bunch of problems. When COVID first started, I remember saying something to the effect of, all COVID did was take away the inertia and allow all the already existent problems to rise to the top. And the more the lockdowns go on, the more I stand by that claim, because it basically just took away the veneer of normality um, from everything and made people actually address the sea underbelly that was our existence for a while. Um, but I do think there is some merit to the idea of COVID showed a bunch of people that they don't have to um, waste their lives in abject suffering just to get by. Um,
I
and
mean,
I think even if that is inconvenient for a lot of people, that was a necessary thing to have happen, especially with the Internet of Everything, automate everything push on the horizon. Um,
I get that, I do, but like a society is a giant machine, and if certain parts of the machine stop functioning, eventually the whole thing
yeah,
will break
yeah,
down. Because
wrenches in the work.
we're starting to see shortages, price increases. Like I've noticed that construction workers are noticing an increase in the price of lumber, like considerable increase,
Mm.
and the cost of materials is going up, which means the cost of the products these materials are made of from
Yeah,
are
yeah.
going up.
Thanks, Joe Biden.
Yeah, and so even if the government is giving them money, that money may not be able to buy as much as they
Yeah,
will.
it's yeah, the inflation problem. Which is why I do agree with the notion of a lot of people have suggested of tying the minimum wage to inflation, um, so that it effectively remains the same degree of spending power, regardless of how much it might go up or down.
Yeah,
And
and
I think it's kind of silly that we didn't do that to begin with, considering that it was literally supposed to be the minimum like quality of life standard. That's why it's called the minimum wage.
I always thought that jobs like that are supposed to be staffed by like teenagers or people who are just starting out in life, and eventually, you're supposed to, at least in my mind, work your way up to something higher and better and earn more money. And it just feels like people are satisfied to stagnate in those jobs. Like
Well, but
if you're
the problem with that line of thinking is when the minimum wage was initially proposed, it was proposed as a minimum wage for like the minimum quality of life standards. That's what it was originally proposed as. It became um, the province of like teenagers and young adults and things. Um, Especially when in like the 70s there was a massive push to get teenagers into the workforce. But the original rationale behind the minimum wage was it was supposed to be the minimum wage that you as an employer are allowed to pay so that your employees maintain a reasonable quality of life. Um, and given that the minimum wage has largely remained stagnant for a great number of years, basically starting in the 70s, that means that the minimum wage is actually worth less overall because the level of spending power that the minimum wage controls has gone down, and therein lies the problem. Which is again why I support the idea of tying it to inflation, so that the level of spending power remains consistent, because it's supposed to be the wage that you earn as the minimum to obtain the minimum quality of life standard.
Yeah. Well, I do understand some COVID support. I don't feel like this should be something that people are should be able to sustain themselves on ad infinitum. This should feel this is something that
Well,
should be
the COVID
temporary.
crisis itself shouldn't have gone on ad infinitum either. It should have ended probably about 6 months ago, if we're being entirely honest with ourselves. Um, and therefore, this really shouldn't even necessarily be a problem. Um, but the longer the lockdowns and things are maintained, the more necessary it's going to become to make sure that whenever civilization does kick back up going again, that it can do so without too many issues.
But I said before, there are a lot of businesses that have shut up their doors because they just could not afford to even keep the space that they have.
Yeah,
The storefront.
the what do you call it? The waylaying of their properties and such.
Yeah, and I feel like that's another way that somebody can fall into homelessness. They have a business, but because of this unprecedented situation, their
They're not
business no
allowed to
wonder.
use it, and therefore can't make
Yeah.
money, and therefore homeless.
I just feel like I just feel like homelessness is a giant Gordian knot made out of steel cables.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why homelessness is as starkly severe as it is because it basically is many of the problems that affect other areas of civilization coexisting in one area and being turned up to an 11 by each other. Because a lot of these issues um, compound one another, like we were saying with the divorce thing and with the child support and alimony thing and so on. The men's rights issues, the economic issues, the um, infrastructural and civilizational issues. The mental health issues, the drug issues. Um, they all compound, and when they all compound, there's really there really is only two options for someone who finds themselves under the yoke of all of those problems coexisting at once, which is either I can take responsibility and end the suffering myself, which is suicide, or I can have an emotional breakdown and become homeless, which is in and of itself um, a contributor to a bunch of problems. So yeah, it's a vicious cycle and a downward spiral all at once.
I think there definitely needs to be more societal report, like maybe change certain things so that people aren't entirely broken as a result. Like maybe don't award enough alimony and child support to where the man is destitute.
Yeah, I think again that in a lot of ways goes back to the social stigma of if you're divorced, it must be because you're a bad person and therefore we need have no empathy for you, which is how you get to paraphrase an Archer meme. Do you want more Arthur Flex? Because this is how you get more Arthur Flex. Um, if you view someone's problems as only and only ever their own fault, and you ignore any circumstances that might lead you to suspect they're not um, the person's own fault, then you're going to get a bunch of people who are crushed under the pressure of these mounting social issues, and either they snap and they kill a bunch of other people, they snap and they kill themselves, or they snap and wind up on the streets, or some combination of the three.
One thing that I think that we should to bring up is there are people who actually do choose to be homeless. Like they'll move into a area with a very warm climate, like Louisiana or California, and because it's so warm,
Or
uh,
Hawaii. Yeah.
yeah, they don't have to really worry about the elements, and so they'll
Yeah.
choose to be homeless. Like they'll buy like a camping tent and then set up and just choose to be homeless.
And um,
Or even
however, I will say in the defense of the Californian homeless, a large part of that is because what with all of the Silicon Valley billionaires and their companies um, hyperinflating the cost of everything, you can make, as an employee of one of those companies, $100,000 a week or something, and that's just enough to um, buy a fair or to sustain a fairly modest like apartment. Whereas in my area, because everything is so rural, you can basically get by on like $30,000 to $50,000 a year, and you're doing pretty okay for yourself. Especially if you already have a home, or you're living in an apartment, and you can afford a pretty nice apartment in my area on such a salary. But in California, because Silicon Valley and billionaires are the standard by which the inflation and costs are set up, you can make more money than I will probably ever see in my life, and still technically be living out of your car, which just goes to show you maybe we should hurry the Andreas Falls along and push California into the sea before it drags the rest of us down with it.
I I suggested that we just sell it back to Mexico.
It's kind of like that conversation the president often has with Spain of like, "Hey Spain, you want Florida back?"
Florida's actually doing better than California now.
Oh, what a world!
Uh, you know, one thing that just came to mind was that people choose to basically live in like these communes, like like communist communes, where
Yeah,
they'll basically like go to an area, like set up like basically a tent city, and they'll just all like live in basically vagrancy. And
yeah.
the thing about these places
I
is
think
that usually they end up collapsing in upon themselves
yeah.
because it's very difficult to.
The values they're operating by are simply unsustainable for a
Yes.
civilization. In particular, I remember there was a couple years ago. I think Sargon did a video on his Thinkery channel about a place in California, or it might have been Nevada, called Slap City. Um, and it was like a community of artists who would basically come out there for like a Burning Man style art festival and just stayed. And everything there is hippies that look almost like white trailer trash and broken, dilapidated um, pieces of infrastructure that people have tried to turn into various kinds of modern, i.e., deconstructionalist Marcel Duchamp style art. Um, and it looks, I think even Sargon said in that video that I watched, with him talking about it, like something out of Fallout or like the fall of civilization almost.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. I think it's been going on for a few years now.
Yeah,
But I think something like that, if it's a handful of people enough where they all know each other well enough to be able to cooperate with one another, that might actually work for a little while. But it's definitely not something that can scale up.
yeah. And not to mention the fact that even in the case of Slap City, I think law enforcement have just abandoned the place to the point that people regularly will burn down each other's campers or tents or what have you, and or people would just randomly get shot for no reason. Um, but I agree. If it's something like that where people are choosing, and again, excluding like property values and such, like it is in San Francisco or around Silicon Valley. But if it's a community of artists or vagrants or wanderers or basically modern day gypsies like that, um, that want to live that kind of wanderer, um, Henry David Thoreau, get back to nature and leave civilization behind kind of lifestyle, I wouldn't include them in homelessness statistics because that's a choice, it's a lifestyle, and it's a philosophical worldview. And I'm not gonna deny anyone the right to explore their philosophical worldview as much as they want, as long as they're not infringing on anyone else's. But at the same time, I'm not going to have empathy for you if your philosophies and worldview are wrong-headed and selfish and counterproductive, and it all comes crashing down around you because them's the breaks.
Yeah, like the Chaz um that was set up in, I believe it was Seattle.
Yes, for a little bit under a month, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and they like the media tried to spin this very hard
As
into
as
something
a summer
positive.
of love style thing, and yeah,
Yeah, and there was
as
theft.
buildings were burnt in the background,
Yeah,
people
nothing
were
going
like
on
four
here.
people a day died or something.
Like that scene from Naked Gun.
Like if you watch not the futuristic sci-fi future of Demolition Man, but the um Los Angeles that John Spartan comes from before that, it's basically like that. And then you find out later on in the movie that it was civilization breaking down, like in the beginning of the movie, that led to the Demolition Man style future. Like that, which doesn't bode well for us, considering that the future of Demolition Man occurred in 2032, I believe, in the movie. And in all honesty, if civilization continues the way it's continuing, I could see us in about 12 years winding up in a similar future.
Yeah. Well, I think it's gonna wrap it up here today because I actually have something else that I need to take care of. Thank you for having this conversation, Dalton.
Anytime.
All right, and next time we are going to talk about men and suicide, which is a real tragedy.
Mhm.
All right, thank you, everybody. We are the Duality of Man. Have a good evening.
Cheers, guys.